Le Miroir by Robert Aickman. Read by Tim McInnerny. Celia's father was old enough to be her grandfather, perhaps her great-grandfather. He had beautiful silvery hair and a voice like a distant bell of indeterminate note, but, unfortunately, he could move only very slowly. Celia had never known her mother, and that lady's portrait was always turned to the wall, in accordance with her father's adjuration. The old house was crumbling now, and something beautiful was lost to it with every year that ended. Even the drawing of an unknown smiling woman by Raphael, even the tiny box found in the Prince of Moscova's fob and soaked in his blood. In the end, one would have thought that there remained only the mirrors, the looking-glasses, if you insist. All the looking-glasses were, of course, mercury-silvered, so that as well as reflecting, they embellished and discriminated. Day by day, Celia's father would toil round the rooms, struggling up the grand staircases, crawling perilously down them. In every room, on every landing, at every dark corner, gazing in the looking-glasses, outstaring time. Right from the cradle, Celia had vouchsafed her frail, dream-like drawings. She had studied every urn in the park and every ancient tree by every condition of light. It was natural that when Celia had arrived at her 16th birthday, she should wish to go to Paris in order to increase her power and widen her range. Still in a dream, she found herself enrolled at a long-established and old-fashioned private atelier. Etienne's, it had been familiarly named by many generations of students, some of them always British. Celia, aged 16 years and 11 days, was escorted to France by Mr. Burfey, the chief clerk in Totland's, her father's solicitors, and of course her own too. But all the arrangements had really been made by Celia's distant cousin Rolf, who found her a nearby apartment, very high up, but with 2 rooms, though small ones, and with what amounted to a private staircase down to the sanitary facilities on the floor immediately below. It was unexpected that a girl of Celia's age and background should be deposited on her own in Paris, but she had requested it. She had always spoken quantities of French, and she could not see that there was anyone to make a fuss. Fortunately, Celia could depend upon an adequate allowance. This was mainly because her father did not understand the value of money, and throughout his long life had made a point of refusing all advice about it, or about anything else. The first things that Celia bought were additional chattels for her miniature rooms, which she was surprised to find almost unfurnished. In particular, there was not one single mirror or looking-glass, so Celia went out and purchased 5 looking-glasses immediately. All but one would be merely for use each day and were backed with nitrate, but the last of her acquisitions might have stood in any bedroom. Celia had spotted it in one of the low, dark, hopelessly untidy shops where, until recently, one bought such things in Paris. The shop had proved to be run not by the usual very old man, but by an even older woman. The aged tricoteurs had driven a terribly hard bargain, but Celia had to possess the glass, for the obvious reason that she could not live without it. Secondly, because it bore extremely faded traces of mysterious male and female figures. Thirdly, because the face that had just looked back at her from its shallows and depths had not been her own. Celia sat before the beautiful mirror or looking-glass, now in one new dress, now in another, and intermittently without troubling to put on a dress at all. So life continued. Celia could not quite say for how long, as her father wrote letters of any kind only on formal occasions, and Totland's really had no business to transact with her beyond paying out her allowance with their usual precise punctuality. One morning Celia felt quite certain of something that of late she had more and more suspected. She was not merely looking older, but looking much older, more perceptibly skinny. The first bright light of spring must have wrought the trick. At least Celia presumed it was the spring, which she had always distrusted, even artistically. It was the season when doubt was no longer possible. Momentarily she clutched at the neckline of her dress and managed to inflict an actual rent. Even the fabric of her garment seemed to have weakened slightly. This had been an expensive garment once. All the same, life has in some sense to go forward, as long as it beats with us at all, and Celia, despite her tendency to melancholy, was perfectly courageous. Moreover, she was finding more and more of herself in her art, and had been assured that soon she might quite easily win a medal of some kind. Of course, that had been said to her privately, in order not to upset the others. She bought many new dresses to replace the one she had torn, with a view to meeting life from time to time in different and selected disguises. Sometimes she dwelt upon what it would be like to nurture 8 or 9 children, the fruit of her womb, some brusque, shadowy figure to pay for it all and act as head of the household. How long could it have been before Celia, despite her precautions, caught her own eye in the glass and realized that she must be middle-aged? She opened a letter that morning, even though dust had settled on it quite deeply. It was from David Skelt, the senior partner in Totlands. He had never before been under any necessity to write to her personally. Mr. Skelt informed her that her father had become so frail that his nurse would have to be supplemented by at least one other, and that her own allowance would have henceforth to be halved at the least, in consequence. Prices in Paris were said to be rising, and the people to be changing in character, but Celia knew that she still had her art as well as her beautiful looking-glass. She realized that her art must mean more to her with every day that sped past. Whether strangers cared for her art or not, the other pupils could be counted upon for loyalty without flaw. The future was an open question yet. It did not take long, by any standard, for the point to be reached where Celia's ever-smaller allowance was intersected by the ever-larger cost of everything. Sometimes the watchful could see her white hair and white face at the edge of the rotting curtain as she looked out at the march past for social justice. She began cutting away the gangrene from her limbs, or what she assumed to be gangrene. She was too scared to use the sharpest knife she had, as no doubt she should have done. The times had become so harsh and the people so indifferent that the art school, after all those years, was in real danger of shutting. Celia reflected that one's art is strictly one's own, and that never should it mean more to her than it meant now, or shudderingly seldom. Faces she took to belong to Raphael, Luca Giordano, and Frederick Leighton now looked upon her, exaltedly and exhortingly, from within the beautiful looking-glass. When she was not at art school or trying to buy simple things with almost no money, Celia spent most of her time gazing. Only in that way could she be true to herself. But never until now had she seen faces or forms to which she could attach names. Too often of late she had seen shapes for which no name was possible. On occasion they had emerged and had had to be driven back with implements she had found on sale, second-hand at very low prices near Les Halles, and presumably intended for the meat trade in one of its aspects. Celia knew perfectly well that if she was to stand any chance of making a permanent mark, as the faces expected of her, then she should practice much more, as ballerinas have to do. She should be plucky, confident, and indefatigable, like Rosa Bonheur. She should probably look like Rosa Bonheur also, though she had enough difficulty already in hanging on to looks of any kind. "Oh, let me join you," cried Celia, stretching out her arms to the real Celia within the beautiful mirror's mysterious depths. The real Celia stretched voluptuously in a patterned dress on the chaise longue she had bought with such innocent ardour. The coloured figures at the top of the frame had entirely faded long ago. Celia thought that the real Celia slightly moved one pale hand and even opened her eyes a little wider. She could not remember whether the patterned dress was a silk dress for parties or a cotton dress for shopping. In any case, there would be no actual harm done if she continued to supplicate, to beseech. Once, about this time, Celia actually heard from Mr. Burfey. It was the very first letter she had ever received from him. Mr. Burfey said that her father unfortunately needed more trained nurses all the time, and there was almost no money left from which to pay for anything, and that he, Mr. Burfey, was about to retire after generations of service with the firm, and was writing to everyone he knew and could remember for that reason. Celia had all along been required to pay the rent in advance, especially as she was a foreigner, and she became anxious if she did not meet all demands in cash, and with punctuality, to say the least of it, and most of all with the rent. These rigours may have combined to reverse the effect intended, as so often in life, because somehow the payment due from Celia after that last payment she was able to make, and had made more prematurely than ever, came to be overlooked altogether. It is not such an uncommon event in Paris as is generally supposed. Quite unfairly, there was a small scandal when Celia was certified to have been dead for something like 4 or 5 months, before any part of her was actually found by a visitor from the outside world. After various alarums had been raised, the elderly married couple who lived far below Celia and looked after the place as best they could, sent their burly young nephew Armand to beat upon the door. In no time Armand came hurtling all the way down again, nearly doing himself an injury in the feeble light. What he had to say was that he had quite clearly seen Madame lying there in the mirror, but no Madame in the room itself. However, this summary proved possibly erroneous on at least 2 counts. The figure seen in the mirror proved, upon Armand's cross-examination by his adoring aunt and all the community, to be not Madame at all, but Mademoiselle, perhaps, and therefore beside the present point. And Madame was in the room herself, though as to what had happened to her, the pathologist ultimately declined to make a declaration. The press thought it might have been rats, and it was mainly that hypothesis which caused the scandal, such as it was. Le Miroir by Robert Aickman was read by Tim McInnerny and produced by Karen Rose. It was a Sweet Talk production for Radio 4 Extra.